if this was any other game or game jam to create the character for the game that I'm working on. First things first, we can't do anything without the color palette. My favorite place to go for color palettes is lowspec.com, but there are plenty of other places to get color palettes if you'd like. I'll typically find a palette that I like and then later add to it, but for this, I'm setting the challenge that I'm going to pick a 4-color palette and I'm only going to use those. I set the filter to only show palettes with 4 colors exactly, and then went through and picked out a few that I liked. I opened them as new tabs so I can click through them, and then I just close the ones that I decide I'm not going to use. After narrowing it down to 2 that I liked, the green shades of the NIMP GB palette, made by Carrie Lake, just stuck out to me and gave me an idea for a cute alien. I try not to argue when an idea actually comes into my head, so that's the one I went with. I downloaded the palette and opened up Photoshop. I opened a 64x64 canvas, which is what I usually work in. If you're new to pixel art, I strongly recommend do not go this large. Start with 16x16, maybe 32x32. 16x16 is a real sweet spot though, when starting out. I also put a pinkish color in the background, and that's just to not have the checkerboard effect of the transparency, and to let me know that that's a color that I will not be seeing in game. And while I play with the shapes, let me briefly talk about the tools that I use for pixel art. I typically design my characters in Photoshop, then I take them over into Sprite to animate. This isn't super efficient, and most people would probably just want to stick into Sprite. I only do this because I've been working in Photoshop for over 20 years at this point, and my muscle memory is pretty ingrained. I just work faster in it than any other program. Photoshop is not set up for pixel art by default. It takes a bit of tweaking to make it all work, and it's absolutely horrible for animating. Almost everything you see me do here in Photoshop can be done in pretty much every other pixel art program that supports layers. Hopefully that explains why I use 2 programs when for most, and really it should just make more sense to use 1. Also, for those that are curious, I use an Intuos Pro Medium pen tablet made by Wacom, or Wacom, however you say it. I didn't use a pen tablet for pixel art until pretty recently actually, within the last couple of months. So it's not necessary if you're just getting into it. But we had one sitting around the house from when my wife was doing a lot of digital illustration, and I figured I'd use it. When starting a new character, the first thing I do is just lay down blobs of color to try and get a rough shape or silhouette. I also try to pull up some reference. It's nice to have it off to the side that I can refer to if I ever have a question about how something is supposed to look. Depending on what you're making, I find tropes can be incredibly useful when creating characters in pixel art. Mostly because they're things that are part of common understanding, so the viewer will quickly understand what you're trying to display. Big round green head with a taper at the bottom and big eyes reads to almost everybody as an alien. Although I think some people would be more comfortable if it was gray, but whatever. I tried to lay out the head and the eyes were just giving me a bunch of trouble, so I just focused on the overall shape first and figured I'd get back to it later. I make broad shapes and then refine them back into what I think looks good. I eventually found a head shape that I was happy with for the moment, and then started to try out some other details. A big head with eyes seemed a bit plain, but checking the reference that I pulled up of cute aliens, some of them also had little antennae, and I figured that sounded kind of like a good addition. With the antennae looking good, I started to play with adding arms and shading. Arms are actually something I usually avoid in my characters. Seriously, look back, most of them don't have arms. But this is an art challenge and I need to challenge myself a little bit, so this one's getting them. The shading is something I play with throughout the entire design process, but I usually like to make my characters in a 3/4 perspective and give them a high side light. Here you can see that the head is shaded to look like the light is coming from the top left. So with the basic roundness in place, now it's time to flush out the eyes. I've learned through experience that the usual oval alien eye that we tend to see where it's kind of pointy at the top and the back just ends up making them look a bit mean in pixel art. Big heads and big round eyes are seen as cute because they mimic the proportions of babies. And most humans find babies cute, so we have a correlation. I added a tiny smile as a placeholder, but ended up really liking it. It added an innocence that I just found adorable. Plus, my wife walked by around this time and went,
"Aw, it's so cute."
With the head going in an okay-ish direction, it's time to start looking at the body. I thickened it up a little bit because it's cuter when it fills out the space so the head doesn't look like it's massive. And I played around for a good while with some clothing ideas and found I just didn't like them much. It was really hard to find separation and do anything that stood out well using only the 4-color limitation. This is about the time where normally I would start adding colors in, but I said I was sticking to 4, so that's what we're gonna do. Now, I'm lucky that my wife is also an artist, so I get to bug her to help me talk out problems like this. She agreed that the clothes didn't work and asked why I needed them at all. None of the reference I pulled had clothes, and as usual, she was right. I gave it a belly button at my daughter's request and finalized the initial design, and it came out pretty cute. So now to bring this little one to life. I brought the alien into Sprite and began my usual process of animating one of my characters. Quick note, and I'll show more of this at the end, because I'm a solo dev, I've come up with some shortcuts that I use to get more animations out of my characters without actually having to make more animations. So I don't do a whole lot of squashing and stretching in the animations themselves, I actually do that in Engine. I'll show that off a little more at the end, and I'll be doing a Construct quick tip video later this week to show you how to actually implement that. Again, as a solo dev doing game jams, I usually don't have a whole lot of time to spend on endless amounts of frames of animation. So I typically go with a 4-frame animation cycle for both the idle and the run. Everything else is either 1 or 2. I really enjoy the cartoony aesthetic, so my idle animations usually involve the character bobbing up and down like you would see in the old 30s cartoons. This just keeps some movement happening with the character even when the player's not acting. For the bobbing, I start by moving the body down a pixel for frames 2 and 3, and then I bring it back up on frame 4. So half of the animation the player is up and half there and 3. And then for the bobbing, I start by moving the body down a pixel for frames 2 and 3, and then I bring it back up on frame 4. So half of the animation the player is up and half they're down. And I consider this the rhythm that the character is now on. Next, to keep the movement from becoming too stiff, I make some elements move a frame later than the things they are attached to. As an example, on frame 2, the body moves down, but I keep the head in the same spot, and it doesn't move down until frame 3. This gives the feel that one part of the body is affecting the other, but also not making it seem like they're rigidly glued together. And to continue this, since the head moves a frame after the body, the antennae now have to move a frame after the head, and then I repeat this process in reverse going back up. By not having all the character elements move on the same frame, it creates more fluidity in the movement. This isn't amazingly detailed or realistic, of course, but it gives enough life to the character for what I want. For me, animating is a lot of selecting certain parts of the body and then moving those. Then I watch it and think, does it look good? No? Okay, let's undo that, and how about this? And repeat. Okay, once I'm happy with the idle, then I can move on. I spend a lot of time here with the idle animation, specifically because it will be the base that I use for most of my other frames. I did do something a little different for this character specifically, which is I added in an extra blink animation in the idle. I don't normally do this, but I did because I thought it would look cute and give more variety if anybody wanted it. Now for my biggest challenge whenever I'm animating, the run cycle. Luckily, I've mostly nailed this down for my style of characters, and I can just usually refer back to the monkey sprites that I've already made. But to break it down, here's what I do for the 4-frame run cycle. Again, I build all of this off of the initial idle frames in order. Frame 1 starts with the leg closest to the camera, backwards at full extension. Remember that arms and legs move opposite, so when the leg is back, the arm on the same side should be forward. For frame 2, I bring the leg facing the camera in with a bent knee, and I move the arms into an in-between state. Frame 3 now quickly jumps with the leg closest to the camera being all the way down, and the leg farthest from the camera being at full extension backwards. With my style, this basically means that I just erase the leg and move the back arm forward. Frame 4 is pretty much just like frame 2, but now it's the leg that's furthest from the camera that has a little bit of a bent knee. There aren't a lot of accessories to help sell motion on this character, but I push the antenna back to simulate some force of them being pushed backwards while the player's moving forwards. After I get the run working, I then move on to the jump, which usually involves stealing the leg from frame 1 of the run, and then copying it and flipping it to the other side. Now it's the back leg also. I raise the arms, and then I lift the face. This is a very cartoony jump pose. No one actually jumps like this, but I find that it reads really well, and that's what's most important to me. I typically only go with a 1-frame jump, so once it's all together, naturally next comes the fall. In platformer games, falling is an animation that the player can be on for a moment or two, depending on how large of a drop you have in the game. So to spice it up a little bit, I go for 2 frames of animation and get a little bit of a flapping in the wind effect. For here, that meant bringing the feet together and sticking the arms out in kind of a balancing motion. Then I took the antenna, flipped them up, and made them shift back and forth as if they're flapping in the wind. After fall, I move on to the hit animation, and for that, I just start with the jump as a base and mess everything up. I make the limbs bend weird, I make the eyes different sizes. You just make the character look genuinely unhappy. I then make another frame and fill everything in with my lightest color. When looping, this will give a flash effect that I prefer over the retro style flashing where the player would disappear and reappear. I forgot that I had one more animation to do, so I actually added an outline to see how it looked using the built-in outline effect in Asprite. The double outline is a style that I've used a fair bit, and I kind of dug how it looked here, so I stuck with it. But if you download the character, there will be a version with and without the light outline, because sometimes the light outline just doesn't work with everything. I added it here thinking I was done, but then remembered I still needed the death frame. I quickly threw it together as it's not really seen for a long time typically, so it's fine to just kind of be a bit basic. I lay the character down and move some elements around, the same as I do for the other frames, and then I replace the eyes with X's. And that pretty much gives us our character. This is how I create pretty much all of the characters for all of my games. I threw together a quick demo so we could see the animations and how they work in an actual game environment. This will also be on the itch page if you want to check it out. There's not a whole lot to it, but you can move the character around, jump, fall, get hurt on spikes, you can even die. I also added a demonstration of the squash and stretch that I talked about earlier. It can be turned on by pressing T, so you can see the difference in the way I make the animations and how I usually have them presented in game. Again, if you want to see how I did that effect, it'll be coming out later this week. Be sure to hit subscribe. It's super easy. And that's pretty much my process for making a player character. I think this little alien came out pretty well. I hope this was interesting, or at least entertaining for you. I get asked about my process a lot, and this was a fun way for me to show it off, as well as create something fun that others could use if they want to. If you'd like to download this character, the link is in the description, and you're free to use it however you like. No credits necessary, but it will always be appreciated. Also, if you do make something with it, please let me know. I would absolutely love to see it.
Найдите работу на лучших условиях среди сотен тысяч вакансий на Авито. Например, рядом с домом. Авито.
Making your own game art can be extremely difficult, like downright painful, especially if you've never done it before, which is why so many indie developers have gone with pixel art, because it's so much easier to get started with than any of the other art forms, and it's far easier to get proficient with it than any of the other art forms. That is not to say that it is an easy art form, because all art is a struggle. Forever. Always. Not to worry, in this video I'm going to be sharing an entire pixel art framework broken down into 10 tips, starting with the technicalities and ending with tips that you've never heard before. But first, allow me to introduce myself. I'm Alvin. I'm going to be telling you how to become a pixel art master. I'm also not a pixel art master. I'm sorry if that's disappointing. However, a lot of the tips that I'm going to be sharing in this video are going to be shared in a way that I wish that they were presented to me. And when we go past the technicalities, I'm just going to go into tips that I was just never told before. Especially ones about how to find enjoyment with pixel art, because let's face it, most of us do not want to torture ourselves for hours on end at the mouse and keyboard. And by the way, in my defense, the actor that played Mr. Miyagi knew zero karate, so there are no rules. So, before we really dive deep into this, why do you even want to learn how to do pixel art in the first place? So, number one, if you're watching my videos, you're probably very indie like me. You're either doing this as a hobby, again, like me, or you're doing this with the hopes of becoming an independent developer at some point, aka an indie developer. In which case, you need to be practical. Pixel art is super practical, it's easy to pick up, and it masks a lot of the not arty abilities of a person. Because it's so low resolution, it covers up some of the bad art, especially bad animations. And it's actually way easier to make snappy, good animations because it's more frame by frame and you have a lot more control over what's going on. As a bonus to this, games are more about gameplay than they are about the best graphics. So if you have a really great game that has great gameplay, your average person that doesn't like pixel art might end up still loving that game because they're like, the graphics kind of suck, but the game's amazing, and which means that it keeps you focused on the thing that's actually important for your game, which is the gameplay. So let's get into software. Pixel art is just filling in a graph. So you would think that you could just do that with anything, and you can. That's the wonderful thing about pixel art. But if you're trying to get to the point where you can actually create game-worthy pixel art, then you're going to want to learn the best tool for the job. However,
enemies rise. Weaponry advances. This war is always evolving. And so are you. Volkswagen.
started making games, I really didn't think it would, honest to goodness, change my life. I didn't even consider myself a game developer. I was just a film school graduate living in the middle of nowhere in Utah. I didn't even know how to program, and honestly still don't. But here I am, a full-time indie dev. Before I get into that though, let's start at the beginning.
If you land it, I'll try it.
When I was a teenager, if I wasn't skateboarding or playing drums in a band, I was making mods for Dark Forces 2 Jedi Knight. I created places like a hotel space station, a haunted campsite, and an abandoned city. I also loved finding other people's levels online, seeing what they could make with a pre-made library of assets, and exploring them from top to bottom. I even played the multiplayer levels by myself, just to see these worlds people had created. Naturally, I wished it was possible to make a full-fledged game by myself, and possibly even sell it, but in my mind, only big studios and genius programmers could do that. I would have to settle with making free mods for existing games. In high school, I decided to go into film, since it was still creative, but it seemed a bit safer and more realistic. Right after college, I got a film editing job that seemed really promising, but the creative work dried up and turned into an architectural blueprint planning job. The last thing I wanted was to get stuck drawing out ventilation ducts and electrical wiring schematics for 20 years, but that seemed to be the only way to pay the bills. It wasn't until a coworker said, "Have you heard of Unity? You could use that to help you with your architecture work." No way, I thought. A free game engine. I watched my coworker drop some trees and walls around the building we were working on. I couldn't believe how easy and fun it looked. I asked, "Well, do you need to know code to use it?" And naturally the answer was, "Well, duh." As a visual and art-oriented kind of person, learning a coding language sounded impossible. The only class I had ever failed in high school was Spanish. Yup, Spanish 101. My brain had the hardest time memorizing words and grammatical concepts.
Привет, как дела? Знаешь об игре League of Legends? Если нет, то сейчас расскажу. В команде обычно 5 человек.
One of the most common questions I get asked is, how did I market the first tree so well? What was the special ingredient that made GIFs of the game go viral on Reddit, Imgur, Tumblr, Twitter? Like a lot of answers in life, there isn't one simple reason why the game did so well in attracting an audience. In fact, I could attribute a lot of it just to being lucky, but something important I learned is that luck is only part of the equation. Here are the reasons why the first tree marketed so well. Reason number 1, the visuals were eye-catching. The bright colors of the fox contrasted well with the beautiful lush forests. I tried to follow the basic art rules of complementary colors, contrast, and negative space. Usually the whole environment was one color, while the fox was a bright orange. Imagine you're like scrolling through Twitter through like 100 posts per hour, and it makes sense that this colorful, striking image would catch your eye for at least long enough to go to the website and learn more for 15 seconds. The visuals set it apart from all the other 2D games as well. Here was a beautiful 3D adventure game that didn't look like other indie games. It looked beautiful on its own, which is important for the initial 3-second window of selling your product. Reason number 2, it reminded gamers of things they already loved. By far the most common comment I read was how the game reminded them of Okami, the Capcom adventure game starring a hand-painted wolf. That game had such a big cult following that they'd attach themselves to my game immediately just by association. The comments would always remark how it reminded them of their favorite things like Miyazaki films, Firewatch, and Journey. In fact, a Kotaku article that got me a lot of press had it in the headline, Journey plus Fox. People normally don't want something completely foreign and unique. They want something they already love with a little twist. I haven't even mentioned the legions of Fox fans who will buy anything with a fox. You want to know the real reason my game did so well with a $0 marketing budget? It had a fox. My first game was abstract and didn't have a visual character to rally around. In the first tree, you were a fox, which was front page news for kids, teens, and adults alike. When they found out it was a story-driven title with a beautiful music score, that attracted fans of a different kind who loved any game in that particular genre. It hit the mark for lots of different communities, and that's why the market was so big for such a niche, experimental game. Reason number 3, I posted GIFs constantly. I took some advice from the makers of the cute farming game Ooblets, who said that their goal in development was to focus on the visuals first. This allowed them to start posting images and GIFs as soon as they could, even though the true structure of the game hadn't been completed or even started in some cases. Marketing is a drop-by-drop accumulation, so I knew I had to start as early as possible. I focused on the graphics first so that I had something interesting to share, and I would capture video using OBS or Fraps. I would convert it to a nice 5-second GIF and post every week. Some of the GIFs went viral, some of them didn't, but I made sure to do it every week in a variety of places. This was also good marketing data because I knew what scenes of my game resonated with people and what didn't. I had the likes and views to prove it. A lot of features in the game were added just because of that data, like the giant bunny glitch GIF that went viral on Twitter and Reddit, which led me to adding it as an Easter egg in the first level. That data also helped me piece together my main marketing materials like my teaser trailer and Steam screenshots. Reason number 4, call to wishlist. Even though this is marketing 101, I never did it with my first game. Even when a GIF got some attention online, it was still a huge lost opportunity because I didn't tell people to act. Normally, marketers call this the CTA, or a call to action. But for my game, I decided to think of it as call to wishlist. I always tried to add a comment telling people where they could wishlist the game or add their email to my mailing list. Even though it still helped during the crucial first hours of launch, I definitely could have used my email list better. However, telling people to wishlist the game is always a good move, and that's because the Steam wishlist number is the most important indicator of success. Valve can safely interpolate from that number if my game was going to be popular or not. If my game was popular enough, Valve would promote it more, which led to it being more popular, and thus the happy cycle continued. Before I knew it, I had made $75,000 during the game's first week, which meant Valve could trust in my game taking up valuable store real estate and would continue to promote the first tree elsewhere in the store. All of the marketing efforts I made over the course of a year were actually all for one single day, launch day. For now, your goal is to find those people who want to buy your game and make sure they're notified when your game launches. It will take time and you'll have to get really good at making eye-catching GIFs, but it's essential. I'm going to repeat it. It is essential for indie devs to market their game if they want an audience of any kind.
Если про Удмуртию смотри, там все про деньги тебе говорят. Там вот деньги тебе расскажут, там, да.
Главный тренд 2021 года в онлайн-бизнесе — это
понимаете,
маркетплейсы. Такие площадки, как Озон и Валби.
Для слабых людей, то есть как бы для защищенных. Ну, это надо тренироваться, да. Потому что надо быть либо беременной быть, либо тренироваться, как бы и то, и другое можно. Можно и то, и другое. Можно я посмотрю такое. Ну ладно.
A few years ago, I made a really dumb mobile game called Frantic Architect, which ended up getting featured on the front page of the App Store and getting over 400,000 downloads. I've been thinking about making a video about this for a while, but I didn't do it because I'm not sure what the moral of the story is. It's one of those events that you can spin it in different ways. Either I could talk about how I'm this really smart guy who got a bunch of people to download my game even though it's sucked. Or I could talk about how I wasted a lot of time building something that's basically useless. I did write an article about this back in 2017, but I feel like I didn't explain the full story very well. And then the Reddit commenters seem to get the impression that I'm just this sellout who made the game to make money. But come on, man, that's like totally not true. I made the game so that I can make this YouTube video several years later and make money from that. This video is divided into two sections. First, I'll explain what happened. I'll tell you how I came up with the idea for this game, how I built the prototype in one day, and my analytics for the installs and the revenue. In the second section, I'll explain the bigger picture of why my marketing strategy worked and how you can apply these ideas to other projects besides mobile games. Let's get started. If you remember back in early 2014, everybody was playing Flappy Bird by indie developer Doполнительная, who is apparently making $50,000 a day at some point from the in-game ads. Shortly afterwards, a lot of other really simple casual mobile games started taking over the App Store and Google Play, and people started calling these games hyper-casual. The defining features of these games is that they're extremely short, repetitive, and easy for anyone to understand. Basically, the sole intention of these games is to show ads to brain-dead people like me. It basically works like this. Bro, you suck at this game. Let me help you out. I'll give you 10 more lives if you download this app first. When hyper-casual games started taking off, I'd already been building games for a couple of years, so I thought, oh, this must be a great way to cash in on my skills. I was totally wrong. It's actually very hard to monetize because there's so much competition since these games are so easy to make. And the user retention is very bad since nobody really likes these games that much, so you don't make very much money per user. But back then, I wasn't thinking carefully about how to solve these problems. I was just too tunnel visioning on researching the popular apps and trying to reverse engineer their success instead of building something that I actually wanted to use myself. So I would scroll through the top hyper-casual games on iOS and Android, and I would play them to try to get inspiration for my own ideas. When I did this, I noticed that these games usually have two companies showing up on the splash screen. One is the game developer, and the other is the publisher. And most of the popular hyper-casual games are actually published by the same few companies. The biggest one right now is Voodoo, and their apps have more downloads than any other company in the world besides Facebook and Google. The publishers help promote your game in three main ways: social media ads, cross-promotion from other games in their network, and helping your game get featured on Apple and Google. These publishers would really sell developers like me on the fact that they had these inside contacts at Apple and Google, so you would have a much better chance of getting featured if you work with them. I don't know how much of this is actually true, but these days you can actually just submit a form to Apple and request to get your game featured, so you should definitely try that out first. But back then, I was just really gullible and I liked the idea of working with a bigger company. It just made me feel more legit, I didn't want to feel like just some dude making a game by myself. I didn't do too much research into the tangible benefits of working with these publishers, but the funny thing is that things actually turned out better than it should have given the kind of mindset that I had. My strategy was to build one game prototype after another and send them out to all the publishers, and I would find these publishers just by looking through the top charts on Android and iOS.
Найдите работу на лучших условиях среди сотен тысяч вакансий на Авито. Например, с удобным графиком. Авито. Здесь решают
My strategy was to build one game prototype after another and send them out to all the publishers, and I would find these publishers just by looking through the top charts on Android and iOS. I used the Unity game engine to build my games, which I really like. It's very easy to pick up and also very powerful. The first prototype I made was Hasty Enemies, and basically you're this blue guy and you're running around and you're trying to kill these red guys that are chasing you by running circles around them and having them body slam into each other. And I know this is really weird, and surprise, surprise, it didn't get accepted by any of the publishers. But then I did notice a little bit later that one of the publishers ripped off my idea and made a better version of it, and I can't really blame them. I mean, they're pretty smart. The second was Super Aquarium, which I talked about in one of my older videos, and I spent way too much time on this. It was a month and a half of full-time effort while I was on summer break, and again it was rejected by all the publishers I sent it to. Third is this game called Square Stack, and it's basically a variation of the classic stacker arcade game where you have to match up the colors of the squares. And this was also rejected by all the publishers. Finally, I came up with the idea for Frantic Architect while I was on a plane, and I was watching some documentary about classical architecture. The game design is based off of Square Stack plus another game that I worked on a few months before, and I think sitting on the plane doing nothing and just watching that architecture documentary sort of helped me weld all those ideas together. I built the prototype in one day, and I included the source code in the description in case you're interested. It's really simple. You just tap anywhere on the screen to place down the glowing block, and you have to grow your tower as big as possible without making it imbalanced. Unity handles all the physics, so I mainly just had to code the placement of the blocks, and then I checked the speed at which the tower is moving in order to determine if the thing is falling down. And once it falls down, the game restarts. It's kind of like a metaphor for life, you know. It's not about how many times you fall, but how many times you rise and get back up and watch my ads so I can get money. 2 publishers offered me contracts for this, and the one I accepted was from a company called Bulkypix. They're in France, and they've actually released some good games before they decided to pivot and work with shovelware developers like me. The terms of the contract were terrible, and work with shovelware developers like me. The terms of the contract were terrible. They basically offered me nothing in exchange for 50% of the revenue. They did say that they would promote my game for 1 week after launch, but to be honest, I'm not really sure that they did that. In exchange for 50% of the revenue. They did say that they would promote my game for 1 week after launch, but to be honest, I'm not really sure that they did that. I got the contract in October 2015, and by now, I was starting my last year of university, so I was really busy with job interviews and studying. I lost motivation to work on Frantic Architect pretty quickly. I didn't think the game was very good to begin with. It wasn't the kind of thing that I would play myself. And then Bulkypix asked me to implement a lot of really boring stuff, like translating the text, or designing some marketing graphics, or adding achievements and leaderboards and things like that. The more I worked on it, the more I realized that this isn't a good use of my time. And my main motivation for finishing it now was just to put something on my resume. This is not very motivating, so I procrastinated now. Was just to put something on my resume. This is not very motivating, so I procrastinated super hard. It took me 6 months to finish a game that I basically prototyped in one day. The game was finally released in March 2016, and that day, my product manager over at Bulkypix Skyped me and said, hey, your app is featured worldwide on the front page of the App Store. This was super surprising to me, because at this point, all I knew was that they had pitched the game to Apple. They didn't tell me how the meeting went. And since I personally didn't think the game was very good, I was very surprised that this happened. Over the next 2 weeks, it got 365,000 downloads, and it plateaued around 400,000 downloads. I wasn't expecting to get this many users at launch, but I also wasn't expecting the downloads to drop off this quickly. I thought that if I had just built up enough awareness of the game, I would get more organic installs. But what ended up happening is that it basically became irrelevant right after it dropped off of the top charts. You can see that my ad revenue per day matches up pretty closely with my downloads per day, and I wasn't surprised by this because I knew the user retention would be low, but I was hoping that I would make more than a few $1,000s considering that I had 400,000 people playing my game. After the game died, I didn't put too much thought into it because I was busy with exams and job interviews. But then a few weeks later, I was really concerned because Bulkypix wasn't sending me my ad payments, and they were also ignoring all my emails. Then one other developer who was also working with them reached out to me, and he said that he wasn't getting paid either. 2 months later, I found out that Bulkypix went bankrupt and I didn't get paid a single penny. But this wasn't actually an important part of the story because by this point, I had already decided that I wasn't going to be making any more hyper-casual games. Before I explain this further, I want to show you the bigger picture for why this genre of games took over the App Store. There are two key advantages that hyper-casual game developers try to exploit. First of all, because these games are so simple to make, they can build them very quickly. Voodoo launches a new game every couple of days, and by doing this, they can test their ideas and gather data much faster than other kinds of game developers. I think that a lot of startups in general can learn from Voodoo's ruthless focus on launching new products. Second, the audience for these games will learn from Voodoo's ruthless focus on launching new products. Second, the audience for these games are very broad because they're so simple.
Ruthless. 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 Ты чё, едят тебя как коромысло? Какой еще казах? Ты что, не видишь, там английский написано? Иди в жопу. Безжалостно, да. Ну, я говорю. Нормально, значит, у тебя все на жухлит.
And easy to understand. But this is a double-edged sword. The flip side is that nobody really likes these games that much, so the user attention is very low. In addition to low user attention, very few players will buy anything in these games, so they're relying on ads to make money. But according to an article on VentureBeat, 60% of the ads on hyper-casual games are actually just promoting other hyper-casual games. So if you think about it, for this 60% of the ads, the industry is actually not generating any money. It's just the companies within it exchanging money with each other. The reason the industry can sustain itself is because the other 40% of the ads is sold to brands and other mobile game genres. The main argument for the growth of the hyper-casual genre is that it's introducing non-gamers to games. So the advertising space is very valuable to these other mobile game genres. For example, let's say that the first game I ever play in my life is Flappy Bird, and then inside Flappy Bird, I see an ad for a more hardcore game, like Angry Birds, and then I'm like, oh, maybe I'll check it out. The main problem with all of this, in my opinion, is that eventually people are going to realize that playing these games is an extremely unfulfilling experience. It's already much harder to get people to download your app now compared to a few years ago, and the standards for app quality is just getting higher and higher. Eventually, I think some game developer will figure out how to make a very good game that actually appeals to a broad audience of non-gamers. And I don't know what this game is going to look like, but I think that when it comes out, it's going to change the entire industry. I think that 10 years from now, people are going to be looking at the hyper-casual games from these last few years, and they're going to think, wow, why would anybody want to play that? It's kind of like how we see those old bad TV shows from the 90s with a lot of commercials in them. If there's one thing that you should take away from all this, is that you shouldn't be afraid to build something just because there's a big company in the space. Voodoo just raised $200 million, and apparently they test out 300 to 400 games every month. But somehow, everything they make is crap that was inspired by this one dude in Vietnam who made one popular game in a few days. There are a ton of indie games released 10 or more years ago that are one popular game is crap that was inspired by this one dude in Vietnam who made one popular game in a few days. There are a ton of indie games released these 10 or more years ago that are still fun and relevant today. But how many of Voodoo's games will anyone remember 10 years from now? You might argue that their whole business is built to capitalize on a trend, and whoever's running the show is going to be so rich in 10 years that they're not going to care what happens to the company. But If you take a deeper look at the numbers, the estimated total revenue for all of Voodoo's apps in September 2019 was only $500,000 according to Sensor Tower. And considering that they had to pay for a lot of their 77 million downloads that month, and considering that they have to pay off their 194 employees, this company is definitely losing money. And at the end of the day, would you rather be the dude in this suit who pretends to know what he's doing when he's actually just throwing a bunch of darts on the wall and hoping that something sticks? Or would you rather be the dude in his room who made one popular game that he thought was cool and ended up changing an industry forever? That's it for me. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.
Ну, как бы нет, значит, ладно. Смешно.
Welcome back to Blackthorn Prod. I'm Noah, an indie game developer, and about 2 weeks ago I released my first little commercial game on Steam, the dread...
Ну ладно, да, может. Не, мне интересно мне, да. Да, наверное. Три, Нет, нет, нет. Женщина, знаешь, чем хороша? Нет. Он для себя так не может наоборот. Наоборот, не думает. Вот это да. Ну вот это он на себе так и думал всегда. Ну вот это и было не ставил. Ну это немножко, да. Ну хотя нет, да. Не сам вот нет, конечно. Да, понимаешь. Да. Ну пересмотри, ну давай пересмотрим вместе, смотри. Ты пень, ну да, репертуар тебе надо, да, понимаю, там типа. Да, то есть как бы опа-на. Понял, да. Круглый. Ой, граната. Ты же круглый, но иначе, да. Круглый, да. Не, как бы для меня-то это хорошо. Ну, что это... Любви продукты, как бы. Хочешь смейся, хочешь не смейся, Аллах другой любви не знает. Продукты не бывает. Ну, все остальное такое. Типа довольно воздушно. Сомнительные. Ну там, не знаю, кто там. Жизнь, короче, да, понимаешь. Если увидеть психиатра, не знаю. Фотографии как-нибудь, ну, это не надо. Объективный мир. Жизнь. Беспонтовый и здоровый, кстати говоря. Ну, это жизнь вообще. Ты же здоровье берешь и там, да. Нужно когда-то. Ладно. Ням-ням-ням. Вискерс. Вискерс, да, ну ладно. то, что тебе нравится. своем духе репертуаре.
Whispers. Until the 5th of September, which was launch day, I hadn't made any money with my games. It was just a large collection of small, free-to-play browser games, usually made during game jams, so in a couple days. But making those taught me a lot, and I used that knowledge and skill to create the Dreadful Whispers, a scary, weird world that has about 9 out of 10 on Steam, which is brilliant, and yes, has earned me a bit of cash. So let's dive into some juicy stats. First of all, some basic facts. Steam, which is the platform I launched my game on, is awesome. There's hundreds of thousands of games, massive sales, and buying and playing a game is easy peasy. It's a dream for players, a lot less so for developers like myself. Steam takes a large 30% cut of the total revenue you make, so if you make $1,000, for example, you're really just earning $700. So on the 4th of September, one day before the game launched, I had roughly 5,000 wishlists. Anyone can wishlist your game, and if they do so, when the game releases or is on sale, they'll receive an email telling them so. Basically, wishlists are very important. It more or less represents the number of interested players you have. At launch, I would be selling the game for roughly $10. The dream would be 50% of people that wishlisted my game would buy it. So that would be 2,500 players. Multiply that by 10 and I would earn $25,000. Pretty crazy. I would consider the game to be a financial success if I made $27,500 in 1 year. That's about $3,500 per month of work. And remember, it took me about 8 months to create the Dreadful Whispers. I wasn't full-time on the job, but many days would be spent working on videos or taking part in game jams, and sometimes I would spend a week or two procrastinating or feeling quite unmotivated to work on TDW. So I probably could have made and finished this game in 5 months if I was always motivated and hyper-focused on this one project. But let's face it, we're human, and everyone will slow down and not be in top-notch shape 100% of the time. Anyway, on the 5th of September, I hit the release app button, and in one day I made, drum rolls, a bit more than $4,000. Again, Steam takes a share, so I'm really just earning $3,500. Still awesome, of course. That makes about 500 copies of the game sold on the first day. Launch day is usually when developers make the most cash, so I was of course expecting things to slow down. But no, on day 2 I made $20,000, just kidding. I made about $1,000. Not massive, but damn, still felt great. 2 days later I had made $600, so I'd reached about 5,700 gross revenue, which is roughly 700 players. To my delight, new players were still streaming in throughout that whole first week, so I ended up with $6.7 thousand in gross revenue by the end of week 1. And during the second week, I made about $1,000, which is awesome. I mean, if I earn $1,000 every week with my game, I'll be pretty wealthy in a year. But of course, I highly doubt things will stay like this for very long. These 2 to 3 days have
Наоборот, ну нет, наоборот, специально для тебя, говорит, там, народ, выцепили просто так, на ухо, конечно, наоборот, вот надо поиздеваться, да, наоборот, это, да, нет,
have been pretty quiet, with only between 10 and 15 copies sold. So to recap, since launch day, which was 2 weeks ago, I've made $7.7 thousand in gross revenue, which is close to 1,000 players. If you remove Steam's 30% share, I have $6.4 thousand I can actually spend. But of course the game will be on sale from time to time. I'll still mention it in future videos, so I trust the Dreadful Whispers will be a nice, small source of passive income during this year and the future. I think now is a good time to also mention that the game has just launched on itch.io. For those of you who don't know, itch.io is where I uploaded all of my small free games. It's a fantastic platform. The only reason I put the Dreadful Whispers on Steam first was because a lot more people were more comfortable playing there than on itch. And there's also a much larger potential audience. But as promised, if you prefer itch.io and wants to play TW there, you can do so now. The link is in the description. Cherry on the cake, me and Dave Allen get 100% of the revenue on itch.io. That's amazing and the best way to support Black Film Prods. Anyway, back to stats. You'll notice here that for now, about 600 people who had the game on their wish list actually bought the Dreadful Whispers. And now I have almost 6.5 thousand. So I'm far away from the 50% I was unrealistically hoping for. But hey, it's still nice to see this rising number of wish lists, and who knows, those might turn into sales in the future. Less pleasant are the refunds. At the time of recording, there's been 75, which is about $750 earned and then snatched away. Steam has a pretty generous refund policy. If players play a game for less than 2 hours, they can refund it. The Dreadful Whispers is a pretty short game and can rather easily be completed in less than 2 hours. Whispers is a play a game for less than. Steam has a pretty generous refund policy and recording sales in the future. Rising number of wish lists, and who knows, those might turn into sales in the future. Less pleasant are the refunds. At the time of recording, there's been 75, which is about $750 earned and then snatched away. Steam has a pretty generous refund policy. If players play a game for less than 2 hours, they can refund it. The Dreadful Whispers is a pretty short game and can rather easily be completed in less than 2 hours, considering players aren't interested in discovering the different endings, alternate levels and secrets. So I guess some players are a bit low in cash, or maybe didn't enjoy the experience enough, so ask for a refund. A bit frustrating of course, but it can't be helped. Well, it could be. I could make a longer, more challenging game, or one with a lot more replayability and randomness to lower this refund rate. So what did I learn? Well, first of all, that making money selling games is entirely possible, fun and super exciting. But secondly, becoming a millionaire or earning even 100,000 is very challenging. Let's face it, for now the Dreadful Whispers hasn't earned me that much. Not enough anyway to justify the amount of work I put in. But hey, let's not talk too fast, it's only been 2 weeks after all. I'm just one guy, no family to look after, and I'm earning money with YouTube ads, Patreon and the Udemy courses I made with my brother. So there was absolutely no pressure for me to make any large sum of money with the Dreadful Whispers. Though it's nice to fantasize about becoming rich with the first game, it's not likely to happen. I have learned a lot, and the Dreadful Whispers is a good game. It's unique and interesting and I'm proud of it, but of course I can improve so much more. What else have I learned? Well, that Steam is tough. The Dreadful Whispers wasn't featured anywhere significant, as I said in the last video. I have no clue how much more money I would have earned had I been at the top of new and trending, for example, but I guess I'll just find out with my next game and share that with you here in the future. Thirdly, maybe running a pretty successful YouTube channel isn't enough for marketing. I bet all of my chances on my YouTube audience buying and playing the game, and I was hoping that initial exposure would get Steam to highlight the Dreadful Whisper somewhere important and bring in new players, but as you saw, not even 1,000 copies sold, despite my devlog videos getting about 20,000 views each. Maybe devlogs on YouTube is enough if the game is absolutely crazy exciting and I get lots of people retweeting and sharing, but I'll probably also make a much bigger effort in contacting press, let's players, going to events to show off my game, and of course setting up the store page much more in advance to build up more hype and wish lists. But the main thing is that I just need to improve my craft. Not even 1% of my total YouTube subscriber count bought the game. That's a pretty clear indication that maybe the trailer and game I created wasn't massively exciting from the outside. I stand by the fact that I'm proud of this world and the overall reviews confirm that. But these are golden supporters and the average player will need more hype, intrigue and desire before willingly spending his cash, and that's completely normal. And finally, what have I learned? Well, that the rewards at the end, like money and reviews, feel nice. Money is of course important, but please don't make games for money. As you see, it's hard work and payments most of the time won't be huge. The main reward is the journey. As cliche as that may sound, you need to really enjoy the process or it's not worth it. As I said in almost every video recently, I've learned a great deal creating this game. Not everyone enjoyed it, a staggering majority did, and I'll promise you this, I'm going to put all this experience to good use. To conclude, The Dreadful Whispers is a critical success with the lovely reviews people are writing. It's a massive success in terms of what I learned by creating it, and yeah, for now it's a modest financial success. Still pretty far away from my initial objective, but that's fine. With that said, thanks so much for watching. If you're curious to see what I'll do next, please subscribe. Remember, The Dreadful Whispers has just launched on itch.io for Windows. Consider being one of the first to explore my world on that platform. Alright, big thank you to my...
Наши сотрудники работают удаленно. Нужен только компьютер и стабильный интернет. Смены по 4 часа в день.
Ищу толковых механиков. Выбирайте график и выходите. С меня надежные инструменты, премии по итогам работы.
Lately I've been spending a lot of time playing a game called Minecraft. You might have heard of it. You know, the one with the blocks, and the blocks. And after spending countless hours building questionable structures and committing virtual war crimes, I've made the realization that Minecraft may in fact be one of the greatest games of our time. It's a game of infinite possibilities where your creations are limited only by your imagination, and the capabilities of your computer. Sure, it may not have the best graphics or the most realistic physics, but I think that that's actually what makes Minecraft so special. The simple graphics, combined with the slightly inaccurate physics, removes players from the restrictions of the material world, allowing them to create pretty much whatever they want. And I won't be having any of that. You see, when I make a game, I don't want the players to be creative or have fun. No, I want a game that makes people suffer and feel pain. Which is why today I'm going to be ruining countless childhoods by completely and utterly destroying everything that makes Minecraft good and adding realistic physics to Minecraft. We've got realistic falling blocks, next generation ragdoll technology, and the wobbliest, most nauseating gameplay the world has ever seen. Let's get to it. So in order to add physics to Minecraft, you first need a Minecraft, obviously. Now I could have tried to make a Minecraft mod or something that adds physics to the actual game, but writing an entire physics engine sounds like a lot of effort and math, and I'm not a huge fan of either of those, so I opted for the next best thing. Instead of adding physics to Minecraft, I'm actually going to add Minecraft to physics by recreating the entire game using the Unity game engine, which has a very nice built-in physics engine. That seems logical, right? Let's get started. So as you probably know, Minecraft has infinite procedurally generated worlds made up of blocks, or voxels. And it's in these worlds that all the Minecrafting takes place, so that was what I decided to try to replicate first. I started off small with a little 1x1 unit dirt block, which is just a cube with a dirt texture scribbled on. Then I made a simple script that spawned a bunch of these blocks in a grid, just like in Minecraft. However, unlike Minecraft, these blocks aren't too exciting and lack a certain depth to them. So I threw in a bit of Fractal Noise, which is a type of randomness that can be used to generate maps sort of like this, to offset the cubes. And now we have some wavy hills. Cool, that's it, right? We have our terrain, now all we have to do is add more cubes and make the world a bit bigger and... oh, right. Apparently, having this many cubes in the world at once isn't great for performance. Luckily, there is a pretty simple solution. Instead of making tons of cube objects, we can instead create a single object that is shaped like multiple cubes, which should be pretty efficient. And since the world is made up of cubes, this should be pretty easy, as all we have to do is manually create squares depending on where the blocks are, update the colliders, for collision, and let Unity handle the rest. And so, after a few trips to Stack Overflow and a couple of voxel generation tutorials, I managed to get this set up. Pretty cool, our world is looking as stylish as ever and my computer is no longer screaming in pain. But it's still a little small and Minecraft worlds are infinite, which is a bit of a problem. But this too has a simple solution. You see, the world in Minecraft seems infinite because of something called chunks. Basically, each chunk is, well, a chunk of blocks. In Minecraft, there are these big boxes, 16 by 16 blocks wide and 256 blocks high, that contain all the blocks inside this area. And Minecraft saves these chunks and loads in the closest chunks to the player, and if the player moves to another chunk, it unloads old ones and loads new ones, which allows the world to be very, very big, since there are always only a set number of chunks active at any given time. So I implemented that by basically just storing our chunks in a dictionary, which is a fancy data structure that lets me map each chunk to a coordinate, and loading, unloading, or generating new chunks every time the player moves to a different chunk using this dictionary.
Stuck at home? Start selling your idle PC power while you sleep. Install NiceHash Miner, and with a simple click of a button, you will join thousands of miners around the world. Your PC will work for you even when you sleep. Register at NiceHash and give it a try today.
У меня было ощущение, что это какая-то декорация специально построена для вот этого мероприятия.
90-е останутся культовым черно-белым фильмом, однажды показавшим советскому человеку, что ночь нужна.
And yeah, loading and unloading already existing chunks around the player works flawlessly and the performance is pretty good, since we're just getting the chunks from the dictionary and setting whether or not they're active. However, generating these chunks for the first time can be pretty slow, since the game has to do quite a bit of processing to generate the terrain and meshes and stuff. And due to how Unity scripts all run on the same thread, which basically means that they run in order one after another, all of the other code has to wait for the chunks to be generated before they can be run. In other words, the chunk generation lags. A lot. So I decided to make the terrain generation multi-threaded, which allows multiple bits of code to run at once. And so, after many hours of frustration and a couple more trips to Stack Overflow, I managed to get it working. Now, the terrain generates in the background separately from everything else, which means that the game doesn't lag anymore, which is pretty cool. I then threw in a very basic player controller to move around in the game, and we now have a functioning Minecraft world. The terrain generation system works pretty much the same as in actual Minecraft, and chunks will load and unload around the player, which allows for pretty much infinite worlds, at least as long as your computer doesn't run out of memory, the noise library I'm using doesn't start screwing up with huge numbers like what happened with the Minecraft Farlands, and Unity decides to behave. However, unlike the terrain gen in Minecraft, everything is, well, made of dirt. So let's spice it up a little. I wasn't all that happy with the boring old hills, so I layered on a bit more Fractal Noise to spice up the surface, and added some 3D Fractal Noise underground to get these cave things. I also turned lower blocks into stone, put some bedrock on the bottom, turned any exposed dirt blocks to grass, added a couple of ore blocks and some ore generation, and made trees randomly appear. And now it's starting to look a bit like Minecraft. Keyword being look because it sure as hell doesn't play like Minecraft. So let's add the player into the game. Now in high intensity which allows the world to be very, very big, since there are always only a set number of chunks active at any given time. So I implemented that by basically just storing our chunks in a dictionary, which is a fancy data structure that lets me map each chunk to a coordinate, and loading, unloading, or generating new chunks every time the player moves to a different chunk using this dictionary. And yeah, loading and unloading already existing chunks around the player works flawlessly and the performance is pretty good, since we're just getting the chunks from the dictionary and setting whether or not they're active. However, generating these chunks for the first time can be pretty slow, since the game has to do quite a bit of processing to generate the terrain and meshes and stuff. And due to how Unity scripts all run on the same thread, which basically means that they run in order one after another, all of the other code has to wait for the chunks to be generated before they can be run. In other words, the chunk generation lags. A lot. So I decided to make the terrain generation multi-threaded, which allows multiple bits of code to run at once. And so, after many hours of frustration and a couple more trips to Stack Overflow, I managed to get it working. Now, the terrain generates in the background separately from everything else, which means that the game doesn't lag anymore, which is pretty cool. I then threw in a very basic player controller to move around in the game, and we now have a functioning Minecraft world. The terrain generation system works pretty much the same as in actual Minecraft, and chunks will load and unload around the player, which allows for pretty much infinite worlds, at least as long as your computer doesn't run out of memory, the noise library I'm using doesn't start screwing up with huge numbers like what happened with the Minecraft Farlands, and Unity decides to behave. However, unlike the terrain gen in Minecraft, everything is, well, made of dirt. So let's spice it up a little. I wasn't all that happy with the boring old hill, so I layered on a bit more Perla noise to spice up the surface, and added some 3D Perla noise underground to get these cave things. I also turned lower blocks into stone, put some bedrock on the bottom, turned any exposed dirt blocks to grass, added a couple of ore blocks and some ore generation, and made trees randomly appear. And now it's starting to look a bit like Minecraft. Keyword being look because it sure as hell doesn't play like Minecraft. So let's add the player into the game. Now in high-intensity action-packed games such as Minecraft, good responsive controls are very important. Without them, games can be really difficult to play, which can cause a lot of frustration. Which is exactly why I decided to make the player the wobbliest ragdoll man you could possibly make. Well, technically he's not a ragdoll or a man. He's actually just an invisible capsule thing because in actual Minecraft, when you're in first-person mode, you can't see your body. So that's why you can't see your body in this game either. Definitely not because I was too lazy to make a body or anything. But anyways, our being here is essentially just a rigid body with some scripts. I've set it up so that pressing the WASD keys applies force to move it like a standard first-person controller, except with one key difference being that the force is actually applied at a point slightly above the center of mass, so moving around will cause it to tilt. Then I apply torque or force to the rotation to try to balance it. And it's great, whenever you do touch anything it starts wobbling uncontrollably and causes uncomfortable levels of motion sickness. And finally I added a healthy amount of post-processing and motion blur to really rub in the motion sickness. And that's pretty cool, we basically have really bad Minecraft now. Except, well, you can't mine or craft. So I think it's time we added destruction. Now in Minecraft, if you want to break a block, you just have to point at it and click, which is far too convenient and easier for my tastes, even with a player as wobbly as this one. I want the players to really struggle and to suffer and to just have a bad time all around. Which is why I took a hint from famously frustrating games like Getting Over It and made the player's hand a ragdoll. And in order to mine, you have to physically hit the block with your limp noodle hand. It's just great. I basically created this nightmare of game design by first modeling and rigging a hand in Blender. No, not that Blender, the 3D modeling tool. Although judging by the quality of this model, I might as well just use an actual Blender. But anyways, I then took this model over to Unity and gave it the gift of life. I also gave the arm just the slightest bit of strength, so that it isn't a complete wet noodle and at least has a bit of resemblance to an arm. Then I slapped on a pickaxe and now you can break things by left clicking, But anyways, I then took this model over to Unity and gave it the gift of life. I also gave the arm just the slightest bit of strength, so that it isn't a complete wet noodle and at least has a bit of resemblance to an arm. Then I slapped on a pickaxe and now you can break things by left clicking, which swings the arm and activates the script that handles collisions to break blocks. I then threw in a bit of Unity particle system to make it look nice and made the block drop a smaller version of itself for the player to pick up, and yeah, I am ready to mine. But wait, there's still something missing. You hear that? It sounds like inaccurate physics. And we can't have any of that, so let's do some physicsing. So basically our problem is that when you separate blocks from the ground by breaking other blocks, things float, which last time I checked isn't very realistic. So let's make them fall. We're gonna have to do a bit of scripting for this one. Basically, our problem of objects floating happens whenever you separate a cluster of blocks from the ground by breaking the block holding them together. So all we have to do is run a check where whenever we break a block we do a flood fill, which is a way to loop through the blocks starting from the block we destroyed outwards, to find any separated objects and check if anything is floating. And we'll stop searching after a certain amount of blocks have been searched, which should save a bit of processing power and also prevent the entire world from falling. This does mean that really big structures won't fall, but I highly doubt anyone would actually be able to create a structure of that size with these janky controls, so it should be fine. Then, if we find any floating segments, we'll just separate those blocks from the chunk, slap on a couple of box colliders for accurate collisions, and add a rigid body to make it fall. Now, at first glance, you might think that this approach is pretty bad, since we're looping through tons of blocks every time we break one, and you aren't wrong. However, it actually doesn't run that badly due to how we aren't actually searching that many blocks, and the code is pretty optimized and is essentially just looping through an array of integers, which is pretty fast. Then I applied this to the blocks that have already fallen using some additional bits of mass, and now you can break them into even smaller pieces, which is pretty cool. So now we can break blocks. The next logical move is to add placing blocks, so let's do that. Now, placing blocks in the actually good version of Minecraft functions pretty much the same as breaking them. You point and then right click. However, I once again wanted more physics, so instead of making blocks magically appear, the hand will throw a mini version of the block, which will place a block on whatever it hits. It also bounces off the physics-enabled blocks because I was too lazy to make them build onto them. But I think it looks better like this anyways, and you can do some pretty cool trick shots, so it's here to stay. The way I made this was very similar to how I implemented breaking blocks, except this time the arm throws the block. And it works great. Placing blocks is now not only realistic, but also nearly impossible to do well, which I'm sure will be great in a game about building things. However, that reminds me, Minecraft isn't just about building, it can also be about adventure and discovery. And that isn't all that fun to do alone, so let's make some friends. I started off with a zombie first, because while I haven't met one in person, I'm sure they're friendly, right? Anyway.
Завизял меня.
Anyway, they modeled and rigged it in Blender, slapped on some textures I downloaded off the Minecraft skin website, and then stuffed it into the Unity ragdoll generator, and now he's floppy. Maybe a bit too floppy. I don't want him to act like he's dead all the time, I want him to be, well, undead. So I added some code to balance him and to make him walk. It basically works by first applying forces to balance it just like with the player. And to get it to walk, I use some inverse kinematics, which is a way to tell foot to go to point by bending leg. Basically, it keeps the foot firmly planted on the ground. Then if the foot gets too far from the body, it just steps towards the body where it sticks to the ground again. And yeah, he's alive, that's just great. But now it's time for the next step, teaching him to feel pain. So I made a sword in Blender, reused the code for breaking blocks, and now I can do very bad things. I then added copious amounts of blood and made the zombie completely ragdoll and death, and yeah, pain and suffering. But now that our zombie guy can feel pain, I think it's only fair if the player can too. So I made the zombie flail its arms at the player and added a health bar and deaths. That's just great, real good stuff. However, while the player is now able to feel a pretty good amount of pain, I still felt that it wasn't enough. And that's because while zombies do quite a bit of damage, they don't naturally spawn in the world yet, and I've just been manually placing them in, so there are no zombies to actually do damage in the actual game. So I made a spawning system and began learning about shaders so I could throw together a little day-night cycle, since zombies only spawn at night. But this ended up being kind of useless because I decided to make zombies spawn during the day also because I wanted more pain. But hey, we have pretty sunsets now. And things are looking pretty good. We have what is basically a fully functional game. But I still felt that there was something missing. I mean, we have a sword and a pickaxe and some blocks, but that's pretty much it. So I added a gun. Yep, gun. In Minecraft. Why? No idea. Basically how it works is that it's a gun. You can shoot things, it breaks blocks, it breaks enemies, it's the jack of all trades. Well, it's really more of a master of all trades because it's very overpowered. So to balance this out, I decided to set up an inventory and a crafting system. Well, sort of. The inventory is really just a counter for the 7 items in the game that you can actually obtain, and the crafting is just a menu with a button because I am lazy. Also, there's only one recipe you can craft, which is the gun, because I actually decided to make the player start off with the diamond pickaxe and sword, because the pickaxe is the only thing besides the gun that can actually break blocks, so you kind of need it, and the sword matches the pickaxe, so yeah. And finally I went and added a main menu where you can change all sorts of settings, and added some sound effects. And now it's really starting to look like Minecraft. You can mine for ore, craft things, build things, explore, commit war crimes, it's perfect. In fact, I'm pretty sure this game has almost everything Minecraft does, save for a few minor things like a few blocks, a couple mobs, and water. But I'm sure no one will notice. And yeah, this was making Minecraft but with physics or something. I'm not really sure, I just made this video because I wanted to mess around with ragdolls. But hey, the end result turned out pretty good, so if you want to torture yourself, you can try playing it through the link for the download below. It's completely free and it's pretty cool. But yeah, that's all. If you want to see more dumb videos like this, and there will be many more very dumb videos, then consider leaving a like and subscribing and turning on notifications and all that good stuff. Okay, that's enough begging for now, I'm gonna go.
Наши сотрудники работают удаленно. Нужен только компьютер и стабильный интернет. Смены по 4 часа в день.
Ищу толковых механиков. Выбирайте графика, выходите. С меня надежные инструменты, премии по итогам работы.
Расширяем производство.
Rain, caves, water, trees. Figure out how these games work and convert my Minecraft clone into something with much more realistic terrain. It should be procedurally generated, infinite, and fully destructible. Let's start with the basic sine wave. If you really use your imagination, it sort of looks like some hills or something. So let's turn it into terrain. In order for it to actually be rendered by a game engine, we need to somehow convert it to a mesh made out of triangles. In 2D, we can accomplish this with an algorithm called marching squares. Marching squares will build up our mesh one piece at a time by checking how the terrain intersects with many small square-shaped regions. For our terrain generator, we'll use the 3D version of marching squares called, you guessed it, marching cubes. And instead of a sine function, we'll use some slightly more advanced coherent noise functions, which create much more natural looking hilly terrain. Alright, let's get programming. After reading through a bunch of articles and maybe stealing a little code, I was able to get started on my own implementation. And after a few hours of work, we've got a pink rectangle. Alright, there we go. Here is marching cubes generating a mesh from 3D simplex noise. Yeah, I don't even understand. Now let's add this to the existing Minecraft world. The terrain generator works by splitting the world up into smaller pieces called chunks, which can be loaded in and out as the player moves around. So just swap out the blocky mesh generator for marching cubes, and it works without any problems. Okay, now we can walk around some procedurally generated terrain. So the blocks are definitely gone, but as you can tell, the terrain isn't really smooth. The solution to this is interpolation. Basically, we'll use some voxel data to estimate where the terrain intersects the edges of each marching cube, which will give a better approximation of the surface. So let's steal some more code, program that. And what the? Okay, something's not right. My code actually worked. Now the terrain is nice and smooth, but it's suspiciously smooth, and still doesn't look like real terrain. The solution? Fractal Noise. Fractal Noise just takes a bunch of noise layers of decreasing scales and adds them together, each contributing smaller and smaller details. Fractal Noise just takes a bunch of noise layers of decreasing scales and adds them together, each contributing smaller and smaller details. And the result is much more natural looking terrain. Throw on a brand new grass texture and yeah, that looks pretty bad. But it's probably the most you can expect from me. Now let's add in some caves. Just like in the Minecraft clone, we'll use some 3D noise to cut pieces out of the terrain. But this time, the transition between the caves and the surface ended up being a little bit of a challenge because I had to deal with that whole interpolation thing. But I eventually sorta figured it out, and we've got caves again. Next, I added water chunks back in, which worked perfectly with the new terrain system, and slapped on that amazing stone texture. I unfortunately couldn't just reuse the tree generation code from the Minecraft clone, so what I ended up doing was taking a sphere and a cone and sort of combining them together. And trees. For terrain modification, I want to make something similar to Astroneer, where you dig these nice circular holes and build these big worm things. So what do we have to do? Just raycast and then increase or decrease the closest voxel values. Should be pretty easy, right? After a lot of tweaking, we've now got this cool little mining and building mechanic. Next, I played around with masking and transitioning between different noise layers. So now we can create larger
Larger scale amount. Larger. Слабо есть дно у меня просто сильно.